Welcome everyone. Nice full house here on a Friday afternoon to talk about a real hot topic. Welcome to the Metropolitan Planning Council, and thank you for attending today's roundtable, Paying by the Mile, a New Way to Fund Transportation. We're so grateful that you're here to join us. I'm Chuck Kaiser, General Manager at Edelman, and we're proud to sponsor today's event as we have many clients in the transportation and related infrastructure space that have a genuine interest in this topic. Also have a pleasure serving on MPC's board, and from that standpoint, love seeing the very vibrant attendance. MPC, as you know, is an urban planning and policy change organization that's working to create a more equitable, sustainable, and prosperous, responsible Chicago region. And we are the culmination of a collaboration between government, business, and community to drive change in our city and broader region. Before we begin, a couple of programming notes. Please silence or set to stun your cell phones, but don't turn them off entirely. We want you activating and commenting on social media. Take note of the Twitter handle here and hashtag. We also would like to thank those of you who give to MPC and are part of the Urban Advocate membership level. Your generosity really impacts the Chicago region. And to learn more or to donate today to MPC and our causes, please talk to one of our many staff that are flanking the event, the venue. And if you work at MPC here, raise your hands. Yes, there'll be more entering the room. Okay, cool. And now on to our program. So, mileage-based user fees, a pay-by-mile road user charge that helps fund transportation infrastructure and maintenance, was a political hot potato in the last election cycle. But attack ads aside, does it have a future here in Illinois? And on the broader national landscape, insofar as we are navigating the future of travel, the insurability and all the other factors surrounding it. Today, we're enjoyed by experts who are working to implement mileage-based user fees in Oregon and Colorado. We're joined today by Maureen Bock from Origo, which is part of the Oregon Department of Transportation. She joins as a program manager. And then Nate Bryer, who's Vice President of Innovation at Azuga, part of the technology ecosystem that is advancing this platform. And then, of course, we're also glad to be hosted by our event moderator, David Schaefer, correspondent from National Public Radio, and he covers transportation and infrastructure-related issues. So let's give a warm welcome. Oh, and last but not least, of course, we're joined by our resident expert, Audrey Winnick, who is Director of Transportation from Metropolitan Planning Council. How could I forget? She's our czar of all things transport. So without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor over to David to facilitate some healthy discourse. Thank you.
Thank you to MPC. Thank you to Mary Sue and the rest of the staff here for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thinking back. I've been covering urban issues in Chicago for 30 years almost, and MPC has been one of the organizations that I've interacted with quite a bit all along the way, and so I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I know about 10 days ago, city workers changing street light bulbs in that labyrinth of upper and lower levels around Randolph and Lakeshore Drive discovered some pretty serious cracks in two support beams holding up the Lakeshore Drive bridge. Engineers were summoned and quickly determined that the structural integrity of the bridge was compromised and that critical and iconic thoroughfare was shut down for emergency repairs. Because Illinois hasn't raised the gasoline tax since 1990 and the cost of fixing and maintaining infrastructure like bridges has soared so much in the ensuing 29 years, there could be little money available for such urgent needs. Fortunately, we had a tech-savvy bridge that immediately went to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and started a GoFundMe campaign and raised millions of dollars to fix the bridge in a couple of hours. Actually, I'm kidding. That didn't happen. The city was able to make repairs in 24 hours and reopen that cracked and corroded bridge. But the incident exposed the crumbling state of our state's infrastructure and just how vulnerable some vital pieces of our transportation network are to possibly calamitous infrastructure failures. And the state is in much need of a better, more adequate, and more equitable way to raise money to keep up with these ever-growing infrastructure needs. There is a call to raise the state's gasoline tax from the current 19 cents a gallon that was raised just 3 cents a gallon in 1990 from, I think, a 16-cent level. At least 30 other states have done that in recent years. But as cars become more fuel efficient and people and shippers turn to more fuel efficient and alternative fuel cars and trucks, the future of taxing gasoline appears to be somewhat futile. So what's the alternative? Well, one idea being tried out in a few states is a tax on vehicle miles traveled. So no matter what kind of fuel makes your car move, the state can capture revenue to fix the roads based on how much you use those roads. So joining us to explain how this all works in a couple of states is Maureen Bock from RUC. She's program manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation and will present some information about how that state is doing things with a pilot program on vehicle miles traveled tax. And Nate Bryer, Vice President of Innovation at Azuga, and Audrey Wenink, Director of Transportation here at the Metropolitan Planning Council. And I'll start with you, Maureen, if you want to come on up and begin your presentation and show us how this all works in a state like Oregon.
Thank you for having me here today. I thought I'd give you a quick history of where we started this program, what we did, and what some of the challenges are and what we're planning to do next. Pretty picture of Oregon in case you want to come out and visit. We won't charge you a mileage fee. We'll just charge you a fuel tax when you get there. So where did we start? We actually started with the first state in the country to actually pass a gas tax. 1919, here we are a century later, trying to do something different. But when we started the gas tax, it was really to get Oregon out of the mud. That was really the slogan that sold it, and it was the first user fee. It was really based on the user should pay for what they're getting. So then when freight vehicles, big heavy duty vehicles started using more fuel, causing more wear and tear on the roads, we adopted a weight mile tax. We're first state in the country to do that. And now we have the first operational road usage charge program. So we're kind of transportation funding pioneers, or maybe we just like to collect money. It could be either one of those things. But we actually started this journey in 2001 when the legislature enacted a statute that said, put in place a road user fee task force to figure out what to do with fixing our transportation's funding. Fuel tax is no longer sustainable as a funding source as more efficient vehicles come on board. So let's figure out how we're going to replace that. And then, 5 years went by while they studied it and talked about it. And in 2006, we did the first road usage charge program, learned that people didn't want us picking the option that was going to record their miles. Didn't like that at all. So, time elapsed. We did another pilot in 2012, got legislators and other people involved, brought in a private sector manager for that program. And lo and behold, in 2013, we actually got a bill that created the program I'm running today. And what you have in your chair is actually that third book, and that's the report that we did because we're required to do it biennially to the legislature. So that gives you the history of all those pilots. If you want to, put yourself to sleep at night, it's great reading material for that. And you can get a sense of what the challenges are, where we're at, that kind of thing from reading that. So what is a road usage charge? Well, really, it's fundamentally a user pays principle. You use the road, you pay for the road, you pay the same amount per mile as every other vehicle. And the program currently is based on, is designed for vehicles that get 10,000 miles or less, weigh 10,000 pounds or less. Because heavy vehicles, 26,000 pounds or more, already pay a weight mile tax. So this is for those light duty vehicles where you get the biggest differentiation between efficiency. So the concept is really easy. You pay the fuel tax when you fuel. It's a prepayment of your road usage charge if you're in the program. The miles are counted by the account manager, multiplied by the road usage charge rate, and then they collect the difference or credit you the difference. That's pretty much what it is. This actually shows you selecting the account, activating the technology, all of that. What the state actually sees is aggregated information. We do not get individual driver information. So the account manager like Nate or Amovis or Verizon, when they were in the program, would get information, aggregate it, and they would tell us how many miles were driven, how much fuel was used, and they would pay us the money. And we're like happy campers because we were getting money and not having to do all that. So why did we do this? We started because there was a recognition that fuel tax was simply unsustainable, even if we kept raising the rate. And our current fuel tax rate is 34 cents a gallon. It ends up being increasingly regressive for people that drive fuel inefficient vehicles. So if you drive a really efficient vehicle, you're paying way less per mile than a vehicle that is more efficient. We were also running up against construction costs, and our fuel tax rate is not indexed to inflation. So increasing costs, it's a pretty static rate, more efficiency. And really the pavement degradation for light duty vehicles is pretty much the same whether it's a 3,000 pound vehicle or 10,000 pound vehicle. So that's why we did a road charge at 10,000 pounds or less. And in our state, we really look at registration fees as paying for access to the infrastructure, not for usage. So the road charge actually pays for your usage. And like I said, why we need it. Fuel tax is unsustainable. When we go out and actually talk to people in the communities about how transportation is funded and what RUC is, they say, well, that's really pretty fair. But it really does require a conversation. And like Nate said, it gives us additional benefits to the extent we can get aggregated data. So the challenge is really there's an evolving transportation model. And this isn't really a surprise, I'm pretty sure, for most of you. People used to be like, my privacy, I don't want my miles tracked, any of that stuff. And now people are like sharing mobility services. So I come to Chicago, I jump in an Uber, I don't own that vehicle. I don't care who owns that vehicle. I get where I need to go, I'm happy. So it's just a different thing that's happening in our transportation sector. And candidly, that's why in Minnesota, they use this graphic to talk about what they call distance-based user fees, which is another variation on the theme. But it's really having that conversation with the public about it. So challenges for us, public awareness. Basically, people in Oregon don't really understand how they're paying for roads and bridges now. So we've done a lot of public education. We've done a lot of focus groups. We actually just recently did a longitudinal focus group with 60 Oregonians across the state that ran for like 3 months. So they were able to interface with us. We message tested. We gave them information about how many lane miles we were maintaining, how many bridges, that kind of thing, and got feedback on messages. And so we're getting ready to use that information in a public awareness campaign to talk about transportation infrastructure funding. These are basically things, a mix of issues that have come up in those focus groups or things that were contemplated in the Senate Bill 810 that started our program. Data security is a big deal, so we test for that. We actually had a third party come in and look at the program and do some analysis on that and gave us a green light. And we're pretty pleased that we were able to come up with requirements with the help of WSP primarily to basically take care of data security. Privacy has been a big concern. The fact that we don't get people's individual driving information has been really important. The other thing that was in the bill is a requirement that anyone that has this kind of data has to get rid of it 30 days after account settlement. So that means that if absent some other kind of agreement with our account managers, once the miles have been paid for, 30 days later it's gone. If law enforcement wants access to that information, they have to get a warrant and get access that way. And generally that means it's already gone. So I have like 5 minutes left, so I'm going to run through a lot of these really quickly, and we can probably address them with your questions. So one of the things we know is that people that are in the program have a lot more comfort with road usage charging than people that are not, which is one reason to do a pilot and get people to try it out. There's a lot of concern with rural urban impacts. What we found, Oregon State University did a study for us, and they found that generally if we were on a road usage charge program, the metropolitan parts of the state would pay a little bit more than the rural parts of the state. The equity concern in our state was around efficient vehicles paying way less than inefficient vehicles, so that's how we talk about that. Privacy, said data security. The rate is actually based on our fuel tax rate. The break-even point for vehicles in the program in our state is 20 miles per gallon. So 34 cents a gallon equals 1.7 cents per mile. One of the challenge for us on the state side is that we know that rapidly changing technologies will cause business disruption, and that's one reason we are partnered with the private sector to do account management services, aggregate data, and that kind of thing. So monitoring that from a state system is really key to the program. Next steps for us is looking at a connected vehicle ecosystem. We know that there are increasing demands for our transportation system to become an information system. So if I'm driving down the road, a roadside sensor can tell me what the conditions are ahead in real time. Current funding models don't take that into consideration. They're basically looking at maintaining the existing infrastructure, not adding the capacity to be a connected vehicle ecosystem. So we think that has great promise for increasing mobility, safety, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and in my case, collecting revenue. So that makes me very happy. We're trying to leverage the FAST Act federal grants that we have to look at expanding the market, bringing in new technology options, increasing public awareness, which is ongoing for us. We evaluated compliance for both account managers and payers, and we hosted a forum to explore interoperability. The idea of interoperability is that you as a consumer of transportation services gets to have one account. And from that account, you can pay for road usage charging, parking, pretty much anything else you do. So it's focused on the user experience. And on the backside, we would make sure that we're collecting funds accurately and getting them to the right jurisdiction or entity that actually owns that. So for us, the next step is to evaluate whether or not road usage charging is viable for local governments. We're going to do that with 3 simultaneous pilots that will be actually conducted in 2020 in Portland metro area. These are the 3 maps, if you will, of what we're looking at. But really, what we want to do now that we have the direction to look at tolling is to look at an interoperable mobility marketplace where road usage charging and tolling and all of those other things reside on one platform. That's the vision. We'll see how that plays out. And this is my information. If you want to call me or text me or whatever, you can do that, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you.
So the overview that I'll be giving is a little bit about, to answer the question, is the technology ready to actually do a mileage-based user fee? And I'll give you the answer right now, and the answer is yes. And so my short presentation kind of goes over exactly how that's worked and the different tests we've been doing for the last 4 years. I promise my marketing slide is only one, just a little bit overview of who Azuga is, because when people say, who is Azuga? This is us. We started out as a software as a service company to go after the growing fleet management needs in the industry. And I came on board to actually take that solution and tailor it specifically to a direct-to-consumer offering. We didn't find much of a market for there, and that was exactly the same time that Oregon had a summit in 2013 on road usage charging. And lo and behold, the thing that I built and designed was immediately applicable to that. So we've actually been in this RUC space since 2014 when we won the contract with Oregon. So since then, we've been busy, and we've actually run other programs as well. We ran one in California. We've run one in Colorado, one in the I-95 corridor on the East Coast, and an interstate interoperability test between Oregon and Washington in the Pacific Northwest. And we found actually the keys to success for these programs are pretty much the similar across each of the programs, and that is the experience. So, it's chicken before the egg. We didn't have experience in RUC, but we did in connected car systems. And we used that experience to build out our experience in RUC. Now that we've built out the experience in RUC, it just built on itself. And we have a speed to market. So we built out a very robust program for Oregon very quickly, and we're able to actually launch our other RUC programs in a quick manner. Our cost is pretty low. And the thing that actually does win some business as well is our value-added services that we have specifically to government, to consumer, and business. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a bit. I promise I won't bore you with technical overviews, but for the most part, in order to run a program, you actually have to have a full turnkey ecosystem. And so these are each of the 8 points that we've found you need to have in place in order to run a road usage charging program. And just a little background, road usage charging is the term that's used west of the Mississippi. Mileage-based user fees is used on the East Coast. I cannot tell you why they're different, other than maybe that dividing line of the river causes the difference. I don't know. They exactly are the same thing, though. So each of these points is necessary to have within our platform. I would point out the one in the upper right, the mileage reporting options. This is the one that's actually very key to actually being successful for the program, is that we have found that key engagement with customers, the people actually driving and paying, is important for success. So how do you get people engaged? You give them options. If you force one option to people, they kind of chafe at it. But if you give them many options based on how they drive and how they operate, they're actually much more amenable to it. So we have the ability to ingest data from just about any mileage source. We do have our own specific device that plugs in an OBD port, but we're not limited to that. We can actually take data from anybody that collects mileage data. So if you're in the technology space, I'm sure you've been bored to tears over the years of technology architecture diagrams like this. The key point to take away in this slide is that there are services built into our platform that are specific to managing data specific to road usage charging. And that's data we actually integrate bidirectionally between us and the state. So things that we share, like mileage reports, fuel usage, in and out of state, percentages, some vehicle verification, enrollment information. That's information that we need to share to the state. There's other data we do not share with the state. We do not share specific location. We do not share driving behavior. We do not share any of the services or app usage. That's a relationship between us and the driver and the customer, and that's sacred. That information does not get to the state, and that line between what's shared between the state and the consumer is very, very set in stone. We also have an agreement with the customers that we will not share their data or sell it without their consent or without their benefit. So we are not in the business of reselling. We're in the business actually to provide the state a service for road usage charging. We have a fairly robust, repeatable process for when we actually get asked to help build out an RUC program. We review requirements, we build out the system, we run the program, and then we just have a feedback mechanism for as new things or new rules at the state level get introduced, we feed back that into the loop and do it all over again. So in terms of how do we fit in with the ecosystem when you include the driver themselves, if we are running the entire program, meaning data collection, the financial system, and the account management services, we work directly with the customer. We give them a mileage reporting option, such as a device or means for collecting data, and they pay us the money. We give the data and the money to the state. The state then, in turn, pays us for the services for running the program. So it's a very closed system between us acting as a middleman between the state and the customer. In terms of what happens for if we have other mileage collection entities, and so think of an insurance company with a UBI program or an auto manufacturer that has a connected car system that's collecting miles. We have the ability to actually ingest that data directly into our system on behalf of the customer. So actually it's kind of a four-way relationship there. We act as the agent, so to speak, between the state and the mileage collection vendor and the customer. So we've actually worked out and tested this out in a test mode in Oregon, and we're working with other states that are thinking about making sure that if somebody wants to be in RUC and they have a usage-based insurance program like Progressive, Snapshot, or Allstate's Driveways, where there already is a device in the car, we can actually ingest that data as well. And that just shows that some of the parties, third-party mileage collection vendors we've been in talks with. So let me back up just a little bit. And we talk about this, and we reiterate it as much as possible, and that is the fuel tax is elegant. It's probably one of the most elegant taxes known to man, especially in the sense that most people have no idea what they're paying and how much it costs to run it. One, you're actually paying not that much, and the cost to run it is actually very low. The problem is that it's a single-use tax. The tax goes into the system, and the benefits are you get to use the road. It goes to fix the roads. And the problems are it's not transparent. People don't know what they're paying, and it's not future-proof. That's the whole reason why we're having this conversation, because the fuel tax, its life is ending. And what's next? What's next is road usage charging. So road usage charging has the same benefits as before. We can maintain the roads and give those benefits to the government, consumers, and business, but now we can do so much more with the data. We've done a number of tests with different states where we can show we could do things like road surface analysis. So this device actually includes an accelerometer in there. We can actually tell you where the potholes are happening. We can use it for remote emissions and other data science needs or transportation research needs. From a consumer standpoint, when somebody puts this device in their car, I've already mentioned one benefit of that, and that is usage-based insurance. You can get a benefit of a lower insurance rate if you have some kind of tracking mechanism in your car. And there's many other things that we're looking at. The one that's actually popped up to the top of the stack for consumers in Oregon is actually the battery health checker that we have. So we actually track the voltage of your battery on an ongoing basis, and if it dips between a certain level, we'll actually inform you. And people have actually thanked us, hey, thanks for telling me that my battery is just about to die. And on the business side, we're looking at what we're calling our right pricing for transportation network companies, things like Uber and Lyft, where they can be transparent in the miles they're driving and pass those mileage rates down to the person actually using that service. So I'm going to dive a little bit now into some of the tests we actually have been running over the last few years. First one is the California Road Charge pilot. They decided to rename road usage charging to just road charge. They're California, they had to be different. But that program ran for about 9 months. There was about 5,000 participants. We had about 60 to 65% of the participants on our platform for that state. They had a number of vendors, and we were the primary vendor for it. The thing that they really wanted to find out is get the public aware of what's going on, and they wanted to test out a number of different mileage reporting options. And we actually had 5 different options for consumers. And so it was an unguided selection process. So when you enrolled in the program, you got to pick as the enrollee what option you wanted to pick. And 65 to 70% of people picked the location-aware GPS device. So when people say, well, we're really worried about privacy, if given an option, most people actually gravitate to that option. So it's, is privacy really the issue that people are making out to be? It's hard to say. Next test we actually did was with Colorado. We actually finished the first project about a year and a half ago. We're actually in the midst of standing up the second project. So the first project was solely for leaders in the state to get them aware of how the program works. They said we were going to do, 100. Mike Warren is in the audience, and he's very familiar with this project. They said there were going to be 90 to 100 people enrolled. We ended up with 115. And the primary new thing we tried there was what we call odometer image capture. You actually take your phone, take a picture of your dashboard, and we do some analysis on the back end to actually translate the image to an actual odometer value, and the differences of odometer values give you mileage. The one downside to an odometer image capture option is that you can't differentiate the miles. It's just every mile you drive, you pay for. And that's the benefit of a location-aware device. You can actually differentiate the miles, and states can determine what kind of rate they want to have based on where the mile was driven. But the second project that we're doing is going to be really focused on farm vehicles and the rural community. And so we actually have a separate device that we're going to be using for farm vehicles, so we can kind of track how often farm-related rural vehicles drive on public versus private roads. And then the state's going to decide what they want to do with that information. The other test that we were involved in is the Washington Road Usage Charge pilot program. There was 2,000 participants, and we weren't the primary vendor for those participants. What we did was we were the one in charge of the interstate interoperability test. And the reason why we need to be involved in that is because Washington wanted to actually test out collecting real money. And we actually collect real money in Oregon. Not the simulated funds that all the other projects are using. So tongue-in-cheek, I like to tell people I'm a tax collector, which we do for Oregon, and we actually did in the 9-month pilot in Washington as well. So the miles we collected when people drove in Oregon, those miles and monies went to the Oregon DOT. The Washington miles actually went to Washington. But because they didn't have their system set up for actually collecting the taxes, they actually just give the money back to us. But we actually proved out that we can collect the money from, one driver, one vehicle owner, and send it to the right spot. And then last one I want to mention is the I-95 corridor. We ran the first program last year. It was a very simple test about, getting, people aware on the East Coast how this works. So when we set this test up, they said we're going to have maybe 50, 60 people involved. We ended up with 150, and that was primarily, I'd say, leaders on the East Coast. So most of the people in the test were leaders of some sort in each of the different DOTs. We had people from 16 different states involved in that test. So Program 2 is going to take what we learned in Program 1 and kind of expand it. We're going to have 1,000 people. My guess is we're going to probably have about 1,200 when we end. And it's going to run for 9 months. The big thing we're going to try there is we're going to do a polygon geofence overlay on the RUC system. And what that means is that we'll be able to put basically geofences around each of the tolling points on some of the toll roads and prove out that the system can be used for infrastructure-free tolling. They also wanted to do some kind of fuel study. Not sure if we're going to be able to do it based on the rules they're trying to determine right now, but they do have an issue because they have a lot of different states there with different taxing rules for fuel. They have the issue where somebody buys a fuel in one state and does most of their driving in another state, and it's trying to figure out how they can fix that issue. So one of my jobs as the leader of this group is like, okay, we're doing road usage charging. What else can we offer to the states as a public-private partnership opportunity? So I've mentioned a few of them: transportation research, tolling, and emissions testing. And there's a few others as well. RUC Clearinghouse, helping states find the road differentiation categories of the road segments, integrating with the DMV for various aspects of smart roads, municipal revenue overlay, and working with the vehicle to vehicle interchange. So the items in blue are the first things that we've actually been involved in lately. The green ones are things that we're, a year or two out on. And I can kind of give details on what we did with transportation research. This was a project we ran with Oregon, and We collected data for 6 months over 3 different categories of data collection. But bottom line is we collected a lot of raw data for about 160 vehicles for those 6 months. We incented people to actually share more data than we normally collect in RUC. So we gave them, once again, we don't sell people or use people's data other than that we've already been identified for RUC. Because this was on top of that, we had a new terms and conditions for this set of data. And we had a number of people that said, sure, I'll give you the data. And we got a lot of raw data. So what we found out is like this data is very useful. And just some examples of things you can do with this data is like, do demographics impact driver behavior? Where do people go to buy their gas? Where do people spend their time outside of work? And there's a lot of things you can use this data that helps go into transportation entities to determine things like what bridge to fix, what road to fix, where's the population driving, and that's obviously where you'd want to spend most of your money. I already talked a little bit about the tolling overlay in I-95. And I'll jump right to remote emissions. This is a program we actually have up and running in Oregon right now. So the same device, almost the same data, but we send it to 2 different departments within the state. So one is DOT for RUC, the other one is Department of Environmental Quality. So you don't have to go in to get your vehicle tested. The data comes right off of the vehicle, right through our device. And when your registration is up, you just push the send data button and your data gets sent, and then you can check your the status, your pass-fail status. By the way, 95% of the vehicles pass. So Clearinghouse, this is for the most part ability for a state to reconcile vehicle information or RUC being paid between states. And then this is the last slide I have, just all the future different things that we could be looking at from a state perspective. And I just want to end with a lot of people compare a fuel tax to an RUC, and they're not really equitable. It's very cheap to do a fuel tax. It's a little more expensive to do an RUC. But if you add in all the extra things you can do with this data and the technology, it actually is very much on par. So I know I had to run through those very quickly, but I thank you for your time. And that's it.
And for the local perspective, Audrey Wenning from the Metropolitan Planning Council here, Director of Transportation.
All right, so why did we have these people come to Illinois? Because we need to look at some new solutions here. This pie chart here shows the share of revenue and its source. And you see here that 42% of Illinois state revenue is coming from the federal government right now, which is partly reflection of the fact that we have not had enough of our own state revenue, and we've been relying on federal revenue more. If you look at the blue section of this graphic, it shows you the motor fuel tax in Illinois has gone from a share of 36% in 1990 to 14% in 2017. So it's really contributing a much smaller share than it should be, and we need more funding. Our funding is insufficient. If you look at this graphic in orange, it shows the line shows that 30 years ago, each person per capita was contributing about $160 per year to use our roadways. That rate has not been indexed to inflation, so the buying power has decreased by about 40%. So people are paying about $100 a year through their gas tax to ride on our roads. And if you look at the vehicle miles traveled, how much they're actually using the roadways, you see that in the blue line. It has gone up substantially. It's fluctuated, but we're almost at a peak again here at the end. So people are using the system more and paying less. This results in bad conditions on our roadways, potholes, need for resurfacing, a lot of deferred maintenance, which is piling up. The blue line shows the deferred maintenance as IDOT has calculated it. And the orange line shows the volatility of our funding. It's extremely volatile. That shows the fact that we're relying on variable amounts of federal funding, and it also has a large impact on the ability to do maintenance well and to plan ahead. The Metropolitan Planning Council a couple of years ago did an exercise to look at how much we need to actually get ourselves to a state of good repair. We looked at the entire state of Illinois system, looked at roads and transit throughout the state, and have determined that we need at least $43 billion over 10 years to get to a state of good repair and make a few basic improvements. So we need more revenue to get our system to the state it needs to be in. And we also have some real challenges ahead in terms of our motor fuel tax and the volumes we can expect. So this graphic shows the fuel efficiency of vehicles. The existing fleet of vehicles is shown in orange, and new vehicles are shown in blue. Basically, people are going to be getting a lot more mileage as they buy new cars, more efficient cars. That's a good thing. It's good for the environment, but it's not good for our revenue and for our ability to maintain our system, and we need to plan for that. Secondly, with electrical vehicle adoption, has been alluded to, that is anticipated to go up. That is also a good thing. But it does, the way our current structure is, electric vehicles are not paying motor fuel tax. And this graphic shows that we could be having as much as $50 million. That represents about 4% of our total revenue going away due to electrification of our fleet. So again, those two factors, we need to be planning ahead for that and future-proofing our system. So this is the last slide here. This just shows what it could look like in Illinois if we were to transition. This shows sort of this sweet spot, or this spot where we would, if we switch to a motor mileage-based user fee, we would generate the exact same level of revenue for vehicles that have 20 miles per gallon. So if you drive a vehicle that gets 20 miles per gallon, you'd pay the identical amount, and that would generate the same amount of revenue as we get now through the mileage-based user fee. For vehicles that get less than 20 miles per gallon, they would actually pay a little less, and then vehicles that have higher fuel mileage would pay a little bit more, but overall, this would get us to the exact same level that we have today. Of course, we need to be higher than that. So if we raised the revenue, the whole graph would just go up. So that just gives a sense of what it could look like here. And it's the rate here shown on this graph is about 1 cent a mile. So that is why we're here to talk about needing to change our revenue structure. And now we can have a conversation.
Thanks so much. I'm going to move to this microphone so I can move about and ask you a couple of questions. You guys all covered a lot of material already, some of which I wanted to ask questions about. But I would like to just really quickly, Nate, can you recap exactly how this works? We'll get a little transponder that we affix to our car somehow, and it is uploading this information via satellite?
Yes, so this is what you'd call an OBD2 device. It plugs in the diagnostics port in your vehicle. That's the same port that mechanics use to check out your vehicle. It's the same port that emissions testers use. The port was actually started in 1996, so any vehicle 1996 and newer has one. And we have solutions for vehicles that are pre-1996. So that information is collected by the device. It's sent up through a cellular modem from the device, and we actually process it on the back end with all the RUC rules established by Oregon. And then we collect the money or revenue from the customer based on the miles they drive. We actually calculate the fuel they use and give them a fuel tax credit, and we give the difference to the state.
Okay. And all this information you said is going to your company, not going to the state. So big government isn't tracking exactly where I'm going.
That is correct.
Okay. And how do we trust you?
It's because it's me.
You look like a really nice guy, but in all seriousness, a lot of people have concerns these days about how much information corporations are gathering about us. And even, a lot of this stuff is happening without us really knowing it. Waze works because our phones and our cars are communicating somehow with, to tell us where traffic jams are, and so we can avoid them. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are concerned about just how much data is being gathered about us in the aggregate.
Sure, it's a valid concern, and it's one that we take very seriously. So we actually have a terms and conditions that's separate from Oregon's. So when somebody enrolls, they sign two, one with us and one with the state. And so the one that we have, we tell the customer exactly what we're collecting, what we're going to use with the data, and what we won't use with the data. And our agreement right now is that we don't share the data or sell it to anybody else without their consent and their benefit. So the only time we've actually done that to date right now is with an extra program we ran with Oregon, where we offered an incentive to people to share their data that the state was not getting.
Maureen, I'm a big Law and Order fan, and every now and then on those shows that they'll have the police track by their tollway passes, what toll booths they went to, who went down the Long Island Expressway and at what time, and how fast they might have been going between toll booths. You were saying, though, that's not information that the state would be gathering.
Correct. And I'm a big fan of those shows too. I wish I could do that, but I can't. So what we actually see is what Nate said. We get aggregated mileage information, aggregated fuel usage, and money. And the information that they collect on our program is statutorily required to be destroyed 30 days after the count is settled. So you pay your road usage charge timely, 30 days later, that information is gone. And yes, we do go out and audit those companies to make sure that that is actually occurring.
Does the infrastructure exist for gathering all this data, this information, or is it just on a limited scale? Can you really scale up to do an entire state, every driver?
Yes, we actually built our system to scale for the entire state. We actually put in place requirements that allow us to, for example, collect information about how Oregonians drive in other states. So every state and Canadian province and Mexican state has its own sub-rule ID. So if they decide to do a road usage charge program, we could get that information, we could capture the information through our account managers and send the money off.
So you could actually capture revenue from people passing through your state.
We could if there was such a program in place for that other state.
I think one of the big concerns, and any of you can address this, that some people have, especially when going state by state with a vehicle miles traveled tax or a road usage charge, is that there's a lot of big trucks that pass through states that don't necessarily have the transponders unless they're using the tollways or something like that. So those are vehicles that would put a lot of strain, a lot of wear and tear on the roads, but not necessarily would be paying for them.
So in Oregon, we do a highway cost allocation study every 2 years to allocate costs according to heavy-duty vehicles or light-duty vehicles, adjust our programs accordingly, and we do have a weight mile task for vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles over 26,000 pounds traversing our state. So we have that, and we're a little bit of an anomaly because we do. But for light-duty vehicles, we still rely on the fuel tax to capture out-of-state drivers driving through our state.
Can you capture, the fee or structure it, I guess, is what I'm asking, in a way to make heavier vehicles pay, and even within, like the classes of just family vehicles, would a small little Toyota Corolla pay the same rate as a big suburban SUV?
So the short answer is we could, but we don't. And in part we don't because that's an extra layer of complexity. And the science that, the highway engineers, which I am not, I will just disclaim that right up front, say that any vehicle that's 10,000 pounds or less does about the same amount of damage. So adding that layer of complexity doesn't really serve any purpose.
It doesn't.
So.
Every now and then, people do argue that, though, that
They do.
those SUVs are tearing up. I've got like 4 potholes in front of my house right now, and
Well, shame on you for driving in such a manner that causes potholes.
I am a public radio cliche. I drive a nice fuel-efficient Subaru, so But my neighbor has a big Suburban, and I want to blame him. No. So the other thing that a lot of people bring up in opposition to a mileage-based tax as opposed to a fuel charge is the fact that you might be penalizing somebody who is trying to drive a more fuel-efficient vehicle or an electric vehicle, a hybrid, trying to do right by the environment and create fewer emissions, less harmful carbon-based emissions and clean the air a little bit better with the use of their vehicles. You're punishing those people, aren't you?
I'm going to do the short answer again of no. We're asking people to pay the same amount per mile as every other vehicle because they're doing about the same amount of damage. And we all know that bad road conditions are bad for every vehicle. So, for example, in our state, the electric vehicle advocates actually have been probably a little more than lukewarm to this concept. One of the executive directors on our road user fee task force, and they say they realize that bad roads are not good for electric vehicles. They're not good for anybody's, and congestion caused by having to do repairs and that kind of thing means everybody's sitting in traffic, burning fuel, not going anywhere. So everybody should pay their fair share. It's really a fairness argument that swayed the day in Oregon.
And fairness is not necessarily captured by a per gallon fuel charge.
Exactly. In fact, it becomes more aggressive if you start looking at raising fuel taxes. Then people who are driving inefficient vehicles are actually paying way more than anyone else. And so they're actually, in some senses, almost subsidizing people that are using the same roadways but not paying anything at all.
One of the other arguments against a mileage-based charge is that those people who live in rural areas who might have to drive 15 miles just to get to the grocery store are going to pay a disproportionate share. You kind of went through that in your presentation a little bit, but could you re-educate us on that issue? How is it that somebody who's paying by mile is not paying more than somebody who lives in an urban area and may only have a mile or a 2 mile commute or something like that?
So there are a couple of studies that have been done. Oregon State University did one for ODOT that showed, on average, rural drivers actually drove about the same number of miles as urban drivers. They took longer trips less frequently, and suburban and urban drivers drove short trips more frequently. So on average, they drove about the same number of miles. So if they're paying the same amount per mile, they end up paying about the same regardless of.
Nate, did you have something to add about any of these? Feel free to jump in if you on any of these. Audrey,
I agree with
you as well.
I agree with Maureen.
I'm just kind of.
He knows he can cut me off at any time because otherwise I'll just blab on. And I think Nate also referenced the RUC West study that showed the same thing.
Is a fuel tax in a way still charging people by miles, how much they drive? I mean, in a way, isn't it somewhat equitable to a per mile charge, assuming that if you have to drive more, you're going to pay more because you're using more fuel?
It depends on how efficient your vehicle is.
Right. But in general terms, you're not going to necessarily pay a lot more when you switch. Can this be done in a way, some people, the idea has been floated in this state, and it actually is in existence in a lot of others, where tolls can change, the charge of the toll could change based on traffic conditions. Congestion pricing is an issue. Is that something that we would even want to be incorporated into a vehicle miles travel tax or a road usage charge? Would we want to try to encourage people to drive at less busy times by charging more per mile or for each mile at certain times?
I'm going to dodge that bullet and say that's completely up to your policymakers, whether or not you want to go down that path.
I'm going to dodge the bullet too.
Yeah.
But if it ever came up that that was a rule or system that the state wanted, our platform's ready to handle it. So it's just another rule. So even like you brought up the categorization of vehicle classification. So from, light duty vehicle to medium duty, you could actually put an overlay of, okay, for these people, you get charged more. If you want to add another factor in, okay, at this time of day, at this segment of road, you're going to pay this rate. It starts to get complicated, and it's just a technology solution to a complicated problem. You could do it. The answer, though, to the question is like, do you really want to do it, though? Do you want to make it that complicated? And people reading their statements every month, it's like, holy cow, it's like reading a calculus problem, figuring out. It's like, I think the easiest and most equitable solution is a per mile rate for anything under 10,000 pounds.
Well, Audrey, we do have a congestion problem here in the Chicago area, and as I'm sure the Portland area does, and a lot of urban areas. It's been talked about. It's never really gone very far, but charging tolls or even turning like the express lanes on the Kennedy Expressway into a toll or an HOV type lane. Would you guys be in favor of using that sort of a model with the vehicle miles travel tax, or just keep the tolls and the VMTs separate issues?
Yeah, I think we're mixing a few different concepts. I mean, I think what you were referencing was potentially managed lanes, where you could take a single lane and have it be tolled and have it be a reliable travel time, and potentially have the other lanes still be non-tolled, and give people choices. So I think that's sort of where the conversation is in Illinois right now, and we haven't even gotten there yet. So I think that's the next thing that we'd probably like to see implemented here, and then road user charges, kind of a separate question. I think we can get to that technology.
Interesting, just as an aside, those of you who may have seen the governor's budget address, he talked a little bit about infrastructure, but did not talk about paying for infrastructure. Do I have that right? Which is kind of an interesting kind of conundrum. But it's good that we're having this discussion, and I certainly want to open it up to you guys for questions too, to ask a few things. But what are some of the other misconceptions that people have that you're fighting against, that people might not understand in terms of when you do a road usage charge and you charge people per mile as opposed to tolls or a fuel tax?
I think we've covered most of them. The rural-urban issue is one. Penalizing fuel-efficient vehicles is another. The conversation what we have in Oregon is always about, we wanted to equate it to paying for utilities, right? You pay for what you use. If you turn off your lights and you don't use your electricity, then you don't pay for it. What we found is people really in Oregon really equate having access to their roads in good condition as kind of a fundamental right. So the conversation goes something like this in Oregon. You want really well-maintained roads. You want reliable bridges. You want safe infrastructure. What's that worth to you? How much are you willing to pay? And did you realize that this is currently the funding structure? And once the public is aware of what it's paid for now, that conversation changes. The other thing that they want in Oregon is if they pay more, they want more capacity. Not necessarily more lanes, but more capacity. So for us, that conversation in some respects is around adding the capability to have a connected vehicle ecosystem where they can get real-time information about the condition of the road ahead of them. They want that.
I just have a couple other questions. One is about transit. The fuel tax federally and here in Illinois helps pay for our trains and our buses. In fact, Metro just announced the purchase of, I think, 40 new locomotives the other day, and they're way behind in their infrastructure. Can a mileage-based tax be used to fund transit, or does it? We feel like the fuel tax generally should help pay for other transportation options, but
in Oregon, our constitution is very clear about what motor fuel tax and our other funding mechanisms can pay for, and it cannot be used for transit. So we have a employer-based tax that goes to transit, and we have some other funding mechanisms for transit. But because our road usage charge program is considered dedicated funds for the highways trust fund in the state, it cannot be used for those purposes.
But Nate, a state could do that if they wanted to.
They could.
So I do want to say one of the myths, or I guess misconceptions, is that this is going to be an additive tax, and that's actually going to be based on the rule that the state sets. So in Oregon, it's actually a replacement, so you get a fuel tax credit. Utah's working on a program right now that it will be an additive, but it's mainly for fuel efficient vehicles that are really not paying their fair share anyways. And I do think that one of the benefits of road usage charging is because there's a technology system that's actually tracking it, and you as a driver get to see it, it becomes much more easy for the state to actually help be transparent where those funds are going. So depending on how a state allocates their funding, so Oregon has a dollar in as a dollar out, and for transportation funding it can't be dispersed. If a state does want to do that, they could actually give that information to the account managers, and that could be shared to the customers, like on a monthly basis. Oh, I spent $10 for this section, or I spent 2 cents over here. It'd be easy to have that information show up on a person's monthly statement.
Audrey?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing about, we're really just looking at a different mechanism for collecting transportation revenue. So just to clarify, currently the state of Illinois' motor fuel tax and capital revenue is not going to transit on an ongoing basis. There is some operations funding, but we do not have sustainable capital funding for transit. And so I think there's a desire that whatever revenue source we have, whether it be a gas tax increase in the short term and then transitioning to a sustainable source, that it be used for multimodal purposes, that it be limited to transportation, but it could be used for different modes of transportation.
One last question that I have, and then I'll open it up to any questions that you all might have, that is one of the knocks on the gasoline tax is it is not indexed to inflation. It's a flat fee per gallon, and if the number of gallons consumed goes down, the revenue stream goes down, and it doesn't keep up with construction costs. Vehicle miles traveled doesn't always go up either, though. And we had a dip about a decade ago, and it stayed down for quite a while when the economy tanked. How do you account for that if the number of vehicle miles traveled collectively in your state isn't rising, then you're not raising more revenue to keep up with the inflationary costs of concrete and steel and asphalt?
That is true. And unless they index the rate on a per mile basis, that's probably always going to be true. But to the extent that those miles are not being driven, that's not wear and tear on your infrastructure either.
So in theory, you're not banging up the roads as much.
Right.
Okay. All right. I'll open it up to the floor for questions here. Justin's going to be running around with a microphone for you. And please introduce yourself, so if we don't know who you are.
Thanks. Alan Mellis. You sort of avoided a question that he asked that I was going to ask about using this information for congestion mitigation. So it always seemed to me that if I had to pay more to use a road at rush hour, that it would be the easiest way to control traffic congestion. So if I had to pay more rush hours during the week than I paid on the weekends or non-rush hours, has Oregon looked at doing that, using this system for addressing congestion mitigation? If so, what have you found out?
We actually have not looked at it for that purpose. We are doing that pilot up in the Portland area in 2020, where we'll be looking at geofencing certain areas where we know congestion occurs. But when we looked at that, we actually were doing it to see if a local option RUC could be possible. So the idea would be that just like right now, cities and counties can pass their own gas tax or motor fuel tax, they could also do a local road usage charge should the legislature decide to have a mandatory program in the So that was really what we started looking at. But, you know, that has led to conversations about congestion pricing, candidly.
I suppose we should say that it is its own political hot potato, aside from everything else.
True.
Thanks. Mark Walburn, transportation consultant. I'm curious about the impact of out-of-state travel. Chicago is a major hub with people coming in from a number of states in the region. Is it difficult to implement this in just one state, or would we have as a region have to kind of get together to do this to make it worthwhile?
If you could do it as a region, that would be fabulous. But we've been operating for almost 4 years as a little island on the West Coast. We have I-5 that traverses that area. We are working with 13 other states in the Western Road Usage Charging Consortium to try to build up so there would be some contiguous states that would also have programs. But so far we're an island.
The test we ran in I-95 was actually a regional test. And so there were some regional rules that were applied, whether you wanted to use a GPS-enabled tracking or a non-GPS. So if you chose the non-GPS option, you had predetermined allocation of your funds.
Nate, I want to follow up on that and ask you about, there's a federal mandate now for interstate trucking that trucks have an electronic logging device. Can something like this be incorporated into those ELDs since trucks already have to have them?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Paula Worthington. Thanks, really enjoyed the panel today. I wondered if there were any dollars from either the federal government or in any of these states devoted to developing sort of serious evaluation protocols to assess the impact of these sort of new pricing systems on driver behavior, because we're sort of imagining a world where, you know, if we put a road usage charge in place, that's going to raise similar revenue to what we raise now. Well, then that's going to look a certain way for rural drivers whose behavior is a certain way, different way for urban drivers. But in fact, those people are going to respond ultimately to this new set of prices that they face. And so are there plans to kind of divide the world into people who are exposed to the new pricing regime versus people who are not, and compare those groups of people?
So the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act was passed in, I'm going to say, 2015. And there were a series of grants that came out of the FAST Act grants to study alternative funding mechanisms. Numbers of states like the I-95 Corridor Coalition, RUC West, Oregon, Washington, California, all got money, Minnesota, Missouri, to look at different funding mechanisms. And a component that we are supposed to be looking at is the impact of those different funding mechanisms on behavior. But it's very hard to do when you have people that are volunteering to do certain things, because volunteer behavior may not translate well to the general public. So I haven't seen very robust information about how this changes driver behavior, even though we've tried to figure out how to do that.
I think we have a question here up front.
Kevin Brubaker with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Nate, you talked about one of the long-term values of this being the data analysis for research and planning purposes. But I heard you, Maureen, say that the data is all destroyed after 30 days. Could you reconcile those two, please? Perhaps I misunderstood which data.
We can. So the pilot that they did where they collected and get extra data was actually done in Oregon, but it was not part of the road usage charge program. So I'll let Nate tell you more about that.
So yeah, same system, but we actually teed up basically a program within the program. And we actually told people this is what we're doing. If you want to be part of it, this is the incentive you'll get for sharing your data for a longer period of time and actually a more detailed, feature-rich set of data. And we found a couple things. The data is very useful and incentives work. So it was actually a very successful program.
Hello, Michael Weiser from Commuter Cars. We're actually an electric car producer. It's a narrow car, so it's half width like a covered motorcycle. I could talk a lot about every issue here, but I'm just going to talk about equity. Recent stories show that people are going into outrageous debt by not getting their loans covered for cars. The default rate is at record numbers. What's the equity issues with charging these people who are paying too much for their cars to be also paying vehicle mile taxes?
Well, I think I'll answer this just from a consumer of roads. So everything we do, everything in this room, everything that you're interacting with this takes transportation. So nothing that you're doing is not without some kind of transportation that got that good or service to you. So the bottom line is that transportation, infrastructure has to be paid some way. So if you're using it, whether you're using a bicycle or a big heavy truck, you've got to pay. Now there'll be maybe some indexes and so many people pay more, but paying nothing really shouldn't be an option. You should pay. So, if the debt, for not paying for vehicles, I can't really answer to that. But I'm just saying, from a standpoint of transportation funding, not doing anything is not an option. You got to do something to fix the problem we have right now.
And I guess my response to that would be, presumably people that buy a car that they cannot afford are still paying a fuel tax to drive that car to and from some location. So if they're paying a replacement road usage charge instead of a fuel tax, that doesn't really impact their ability to pay for or not pay for the actual vehicle itself.
Hi, sorry. Estelle Tina with Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. I also had a question about equity considerations for lower income drivers. So we know the fuel tax is inherently inequitable, but so is the road usage charge. And I know the discussion has been about the fact that the road usage charge is less inequitable potentially than a fuel tax. But sort of to just challenge ourselves a little bit, what sort of measures can be taken to advance equity, and because we should really be aiming to propose policies and programs that are equitable as opposed to just less inequitable than the status quo. And then a second question related to that is, as you're developing pilot programs, have you considered testing different measures that might advance equity? Thanks.
Equity is a big concern in pretty much every conversation I have. So I don't have any good answers. I think that's an interesting question, how you means test people's ability to pay for their usage of transportation infrastructure. Right now, I'm concerned with growing a very small program to make sure that it is pretty seamless and people have a good user experience. And I think all of those other questions about incentivizing different behaviors and all of those things will naturally occur as programs mature. But I think it's hard to expect a toddler to run a marathon. And I think that's how I equate my program right now, is it's really at its infancy. And so answering a lot of complicated questions when policymakers haven't really come up with good metrics around those things, I can't do that. I'd love to, but I can't.
But like the person who asked the question said, the fuel tax already is fairly regressive.
And it becomes more regressive as it increases.
I just wanted to say something about the flip side of the problem of where the money's getting spent. So I think part of it is raising the revenue, and the other part is making sure that the way you're investing the money is equitable. And so if you're investing in biking, walking, and transit substantially, then you're giving people low cost and free options as well, so that they can ultimately, maybe not have to drive as much and not have to pay those costs. So just thinking about how you're transforming your system and making your investments is also part of the thought process of equity.
I think we have another question here.
Ellen Partridge from the Shared Use Mobility Center. So being mindful of what you just said about not addressing these larger issues, I do wonder whether the discussion in the legislature or with the advocacy groups also looks at how this impacts the CO2 emissions. Because, there are other alternatives. You could have a carbon tax. So do people see a VMT tax as somehow being, completely excluding another kind of tax? Or do they see this just as, not addressing the climate change issues?
There is currently in our legislature a consideration of a cap and trade to deal with greenhouse gas emissions in large measure. There have been conversations around leaving fuel tax in place as a carbon tax to incentivize people to buy more efficient vehicles and not use as an offset for road usage charging. Those are conversations that occur with the policymakers. I provide basic data. I don't, speak on behalf of ODOT or anyone else about what those are. I will say that motor fuel tax in our state has been pledged revenue to repay bonds, and so we know that turning it off immediately is not going to be popular. It will kill our bond rating, so we know it's going to remain in place. So how you deal with those systemic issues in funding transportation, paying for bonds, generating new revenue are all very complicated conversations. And I think the sooner you start having them with the public so they understand them, the better.
I think we have time for just one more
I
question.
know that wasn't an answer.
Mary?
Thank you. Mary Vishnevsky from the Chicago Tribune. This is a question for Audrey and Maureen. We haven't been able to get the lawmakers in Illinois to even raise the gas tax since 1990. So what's it going to take for them to even consider a test program here?
Well, for better or worse, there was a bill introduced a week ago for a VMT pilot, and it died yesterday. So there is a need to have this conversation. Honestly, that's why we're having this conversation today, to debunk some of the myths about different mechanisms and reduce the amount of fear about changing to different mechanisms. I'm optimistic that there may be an infrastructure bill this year, but I think it's still a lot of conversation has to happen about it. And we would advocate that even if we have a gas tax increase that's a short-term solution, there needs to be some type of pilot for a road usage charge embedded into that so that we're starting to learn like these other states have and start to future-proof. If we just raise the gas tax without considering any other transition, that's very short thinking, short-term thinking.
And I guess all I would say is it took us a long time to get to having a program. As you recall in my slides, I said in 2001, the Oregon legislature said, we're going to create this task force to look at developing a sustainable funding solution. If your legislature even did that, and started populating with people who had an interest in figuring out how to fund your infrastructure going forward, that would probably help your conversation significantly. It did in our state.
And just to add on to that, anybody who's followed Illinois politics for any amount of time knows that nothing is ever really dead in Springfield, and you'd be surprised at what ends up being tacked on to a bill at the last second of session. One real quick question, could you, I know you've had your hand up for a while.
You kind of addressed it, but I'm State Representative Debbie Myers-Martin. And I just was curious, realistically, how, if Illinois were to choose this as a strategy, how long would that be from beginning, pilot, testing, to actually implementation? Realistically.
Well, okay, so when we set up our program, we had a bill passed in a 2013 legislative session that said you will have an active program up and running by July 1st, 2015. So bill passes 2013, roughly July timeframe. 2 years later, we were live, and we were still negotiating contracts with our vendors, namely Azuga, Amovis, and Verizon in November of 2014. So they didn't start system development until they had about 6 months, and we put them through certification and testing and everything else. So it can be done fairly quickly.
If there's a political will.
Exactly.
Which is why, Representative, we're so glad you're here. I think we're just about out of time. Mary Sue, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. Just some very quick thank yous and observations. I'm Mary Sue Barrett, president of the Metropolitan Planning Council. And first, our thanks to our out-of-town guests who traveled far to bring their expertise. We're really, really grateful. I know that that Maureen took a day off of work to be here with us, and Nate also traveled far from Colorado. So this expertise really grounds this conversation, which is so timely for us. And David, you and I have known each other a long time, as you said, and his distinctive voice, his thoughtful reporting is really a favorite of mine, and I know of so many of yours. So the fact that he's taken an interest in Chicago as a laboratory for innovation, we think you're helping set the standard high, which is exactly what we need. And Audrey Wennick, who has been part of MPC's leadership team for more than a couple years now, has really helped chart this course. And I so appreciate what she laid out about the urgency and the rationale, that we have to remind people that it has been since 1991 since we raised the gas tax. And what else in your life has not increased in cost? Is it your utility bill, your cable bill, your phone bill? No. There's many things that we know cost more just because life costs more. And you also, Audrey, highlighted a number of things that I think people here can help others understand, that the purchasing power of that gas tax has declined for a variety of reasons, that we want to be an innovator, and in fact, we have to be an innovator because we're behind by $43 billion over 10 years. And that as we broker solutions in the very near term, there's an article on your seats from Cranes this week, co-authored by myself and the head of the Chicagoland Chamber, Jack Lavin, the head of the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club, Kelly Welsh. Our three organizations and many others are working together with this unified voice. So short-term solutions because the urgency is now, and planning for the future because that's what smart places do. So if you know Metropolitan Planning Council, and some of you are new joining us here today, we're delighted that you are. One of the things that we'd want you to know is that we're independent and nonpartisan, we're trusted, we're data-driven, and we're bold. And so if the skeptic in you is saying, even after hearing the conversation, this might be able to happen in places like Oregon, but there's something in the water there, and we're different here in Illinois, I would point you to a couple of things. First of all, we were the place that relocated the lanes of Lakeshore Drive to create a museum campus. We were the place that created a deck on top of railroad tracks to create Millennium Park. We were the place that took two separate agencies that were not strong, the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission and CAT separately, and brought them together into CMAP, a much stronger regional leader organization. And we're also the place, MPC's been involved in quantifying the cost to all of us of segregation, and has sparked conversations literally in the last year or two in boardrooms and in legislative chambers about a racial equity solution for every institution. So I believe we can be the place of innovation again. Even today, in our aldermanic and mayoral race, you see a majority of the 50 aldermen going on record in support of some reasonable limits to aldermanic prerogative in relation to affordable housing approvals. A year ago, 2 years ago, people would have said that was impossible. So political will can change, and it changes when we come together, and when we set our sights high and we bring data and the right people together. So that's what we try to do, and you being in this room here together with us helps us do that. I want to thank again Chuck Kaiser, one of MPC's board members from Edelman, for being our sponsor here today, and urge you all to stay in touch with us on our website, metroplanning.org, and to help us spread the word about the urgency for action and how we can all benefit. Smart investments are going to grow this economy, and growth is something we desperately need. Thank you again to our panelists and to all of you.